issue is seen from a regional point of view. And that brings us to our next speaker, a colleague of mine at INSS. We work together at the Institute for National Security Studies, not far around the corner here. Dr. Emily Landau is Director of the Arms Control and Regional Security Project for a number of years at our institute. She has her PhD from the Hebrew University and is a Senior Research Associate at INSS. I think probably many people here in the room know and have read work done by Dr. Landau, who has written extensively in the whole area of nuclear proliferation and arms control, with particular emphasis on the two critical issues of our day today, mainly Iran and North Korea, and has also written in trying to differentiate very exclusively of these two issues. Her recent book, which just came out in 2006, Arms Control in the Middle East, Cooperative Security Dialogue and Regional Constraint. And Emily also teaches both here at Tel Aviv University and at the University of Haifa. And her paper is really a following of what we had before, which wants to discuss the area of, or the issue of Iran's nuclear aspirations in a wider context, i.e. in the context of the regional dimensions. Emily, the floor is yours. If you want from here, go right ahead.
Thank you, Yuta. Good afternoon. Let me begin by thanking the organizers of this conference for inviting me. As has so often been the case with regard to efforts to curb Iran's nuclear ambitions over the past almost 7 years now, we're once again on the verge of a potentially significant development. And this time the development is the prospect of a U.S.-Iranian dialogue. At this point, we're still, unfortunately, pretty much in the dark with regard to the two most important questions with regard to these negotiations. One, what they're going to talk about, and two, how they're going to do it. Nevertheless, on the basis of some initial indications that we already have, what I would like to focus on this afternoon is the question of the regional dimension of Iran's nuclear ambitions, how this is likely to play out in the talks with the United States, at least as far as the U.S. approach is concerned. Now, when we look back on the past 7 years of dealing with Iran, we find that international efforts to confront and to contain Iran since 2002 were characterized by a tension between two focal points. The first focal point was the tendency to deal with this issue solely with regard to the nuclear activity itself, through the prism of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, the famous NPT, and with the goal of convincing and or pressuring Iran back into the fold of its nonproliferation commitments. Iran is, of course, a party to the NPT in the status of a non-nuclear state, which means that Iran has taken it upon itself to remain non-nuclear. The second tendency has been to relate to a wider spectrum of regional realities and state interests, with the understanding that these factors are inextricably linked to the nuclear challenge that Iran poses. Up until now, the first tendency has very clearly dominated the agenda, even though international actors facing Iran no doubt understood all along the broader context within which this nuclear challenge is embedded. Concrete efforts continued to focus on the nuclear issue as such. But all that is about to change as Barack Obama prepares to adopt a regional approach for dealing with Iran. Now, the truth is that the approach that focused solely on the nuclear issue and on Iran's noncompliance with the NPT had actually run its course well before Barack Obama was elected president. And the reason was not that the approach in itself was flawed or somehow invalid, but rather that even with all of the evidence that we had that Iran was working on the development of a military nuclear option, still it proved virtually impossible to build an ironclad case against Iran solely on the basis of NPT criteria. And the gaps in this case were filled with the divergent political interests that split the states that were confronting Iran: the United States, the EU3, France, Britain, Germany, Russia, and China, which weakened their ability to stop Iran. And this resulted in valuable time being lost in these international efforts, especially since 2005, when Iran has really been moving full force ahead with its uranium enrichment, with its missile program. Now, logically speaking, if Iran's interest in a military nuclear program is primarily a function of its regional ambitions, and I believe that this is the case, then there's much to be said for shifting the focus of efforts to deal with Iran to the regional sphere. In other words, if the problem is regional, then the solution probably should be regional as well. Therefore, the prospect of a broader context of interstate relations and regional politics becoming part and parcel of a diplomatic strategy for confronting Iran's nuclear activities is a significant development, and one that actually could open more space for new and creative initiatives. However, all of this depends on what kind of regional approach Obama adopts. And it remains to be seen what kind of linkages Obama will support and how, and whether he will be able to come up with a formula to effectively curtail Iran's plans to use its prospective nuclear status in order to further its political hegemonic goals in the Gulf region and the wider Middle East. And I must say that initial indications are unfortunately not looking promising, even though regional conditions are actually currently ripe for pressuring Iran in the regional sphere. Obama could actually build upon the current regional backlash against Iran in order to strengthen his hand in any regional discussion with it. However, again, so far indications are that he is not moving productively in this direction. So in the time remaining, what I would like to do is first to highlight the evidence of the changed regional circumstances and the greater opposition to Iran. Then I would like to discuss a little bit where I think Obama is not getting it right so far, specifically by linking Iran to the Israeli-Palestinian issue and by prioritizing Iraq, Pakistan, and Afghanistan over Iran. And finally, I'll briefly discuss some problems of carrying out negotiations with Iran in any case, regardless of what's put on the table. So first, the new opposition to Iran. Moderate Arab states have been expressing sporadic concern with Iran's nuclear program and ambitions since about late 2005, and we heard the data just now. But until quite recently, their approach remained very much non-committal. In the closing months of 2008, however, they began distancing themselves from Iran in a much more serious and public manner. And this underscored their growing impatience with the pace of efforts to confront Iran and their fear that the United States might negotiate a deal with Iran that would be at their expense. So we saw that in early November 2008, for the very first time, 5 Arab states, Bahrain, Jordan, Egypt, Morocco, and the United Arab Emirates, took a clear and open stand against Iran at a meeting on the sidelines of a meeting of the Quartet in Sharm el-Sheikh. The Arab foreign ministers expressed their concern about growing Iranian influence in the Middle East and their desire to be better informed about negotiations with Iran. This was the first time that they had expressed this in quite this way. The following month, this position was significantly enhanced when Arab diplomats from 8 countries met with members of the P5+1. Those are the P5 is the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. The 1 is Germany. And Iran's harsh reaction to reports of this meeting, I think, underscore that Iran was very much concerned by this very public Arab position. Iran's parliament speaker, Ali Larijani, called on Arab states not to interfere in Iran's nuclear case, and the foreign ministry went so far as to call the meeting a Trojan horse plot by the West in order to convince Arab states to side with them against Iran on the nuclear issue. An additional important development was, of course, Operation Cast Lead, which significantly, I think, increased regional opposition to Iran. If Iran was hoping to use its proxy, Hamas, to demonstrate its regional strength by stirring up trouble in the Middle East, I think this plan backfired at least somewhat. The poor performance of Hamas undermined this goal as events exposed Iran as a force of instability in the region, using its proxy, Hamas, to encourage violence against Israel and tensions in the broader Middle East. Egypt, and to a lesser extent Saudi Arabia, adopted strong positions against Hamas in the recent round of violence. In criticizing Hamas, Egypt was, of course, following its national interest. But what is particularly noteworthy is that by taking this position, Mubarak was going against popular opinion, the so-called Arab Street, which is conditioned to oppose Israel basically no matter what, but definitely on issues that relate to the Palestinians. And in the weeks following Operation Cast Lead, Egypt continued to speak out against radicalism, and his criticism was now aimed directly at Iran. Mubarak declared that he would not allow Iran to rehabilitate Gaza, and Egypt's foreign minister, Abul Gate, reconfirmed Egypt's rejection of Iran's embrace of radicalism while underscoring Egypt's own strategic choice to follow the path of peace. Now, the increase in opposition to Iran among the moderate states in the region, of course, touches directly on the very foundation that Iran itself is trying to establish for the enhancement of its hegemonic plans, namely creating the conditions to bring these states under its sphere of influence. In March 2009, in the face of continued expressions of concern on the part of the moderate Arab states, especially in the Persian Gulf, new Secretary of State Hillary Clinton reassured the Persian Gulf states that the U.S. would consult with them with regard to its prospective dialogue with Iran, and these assurances were once again issued earlier this month by Defense Secretary Robert Gates. Before these reassurances, the Saudi foreign minister had gone so far as to call on Arab allies to unite against Iran. He claimed that when armed with nuclear weapons, Iran would seek to dominate the Middle East. The Gulf states fear that advancing a U.S. initiative in itself will lift pressure from Iran's nuclear program and embolden it to expand its influence in the region. Moreover, in light of what they perceive of as Obama's preference or favoring of Iran and Syria over the traditional Arab allies of the United States, they fear a deal, of course, between the U.S. and Iran for sharing influence in the Gulf that will leave them outside the fold. States in the Persian Gulf have, of course, been further alienated of late by Iranian statements hinting at Iran's belief that historically Bahrain is part of Iran, and by the ongoing and intensifying dispute with the United Arab Emirates over the sovereignty of the three small islands in the Persian Gulf. Future dealings with Iran will have to strike a smart balance between effectively utilizing regional opposition to Iran's hegemonic tendencies in the context of negotiations and the tendency to strike a bilateral deal with Iran that would result in enhancing its regional clout at the expense of the moderate states in the region. So far, from what we can gather of Obama's emerging approach, it seems to be moving, unfortunately, more in the direction of enhancing Iran's regional clout rather than curtailing it. A first indication of this is the regional linkage that the Obama administration put forth several weeks ago, namely making progress on Iran contingent on Israel moving forward in the Israeli-Palestinian front. The logic behind this being that Secretary of State Clinton explained this, the logic being that it was necessary in order to gain Arab support for Israel's position on Iran. I would say that this linkage is, at the very least, misguided. First, there's no ready solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that is contingent on a simple change of position on the part of Israel. Second, Iran itself, through Hamas, is a major potential spoiler of any progress in the direction of peace. But most importantly, stopping Iran is the strong interest of many Arab states, regardless of what happens in the Palestinian sphere. I believe they have no interest in postponing the process of dealing with Iran for the sake of the Palestinians, and they're actually quite wary of this kind of grand bargain thinking. And as we saw in the case of Mubarak and Cast Lead, when there is a strong interest, strong national interest, public opinion can take a back seat. Indeed, by advocating this link, I think the Obama administration is actually creating tensions that could serve Iran's interests rather than undermine them, so that ultimately this kind of flawed strategic logic could work to Iran's advantage. And I think it provides a very good example of how not to proceed in the regional sphere. On a more positive note, it seems that Secretary of State Clinton, in her appearance before the Senate late last week, backtracked a bit on this linkage and clarified that the U.S. is not making Iran dependent on the Palestinian issue. Rather, the two should proceed in parallel. A second potentially problematic regional emphasis regards the U.S. preference for focusing first on Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And the U.S. also believes that it needs Iran's help in dealing with these challenges. And for both of these reasons, the kind of bargain being considered could move more in the direction of these states, which would mean letting up pressure in terms of curbing Iran's hegemonic tendencies in our part of the Middle East. My final comments go to the question of how to negotiate with Iran, no matter what is on the table. And I think it needs to be clear that it's crucial for the United States to enter negotiations with Iran with a strong hand. But the early indication of Barack Obama's new approach hinted at a weakening of U.S. resolve. And I want to make it clear that the problem, as I see it, was not that the U.S. administration clarified that it would pursue negotiations with Iran without regard to the precondition that had precluded negotiations for at least 3 years, namely the demand for an immediate halt of all activities related to uranium enrichment. Actually, this position was necessary in order to break the deadlock on dialogue. The problem, as I see it, was with later reports that indicated further unnecessary erosion of previous U.S. positions on the negotiations before they had even begun. Specifically, in early April, it was reported that as part of Obama's policy review, diplomats were already discussing whether the U.S. will have to ultimately accept continued existence of Iran's uranium enrichment activities. Obama's image of an outstretched hand in return for Iran's unclenched fist implies the demand that Iran negotiate in good faith with the United States with an at least implicit threat of consequences if it does not. Now, this strategy critically depends for success on an effective move from carrots to sticks if it turns out that Iran is not negotiating seriously. But once the sides become engaged in diplomacy and dialogue, making the call that Iran is not serious is not as easy as it might sound. And this was a major, major sore point in the 2003-2005 Iran-EU3 negotiations. As the parties invest more and more in the diplomatic track, the impulse to cling to any evidence that there's still hope can be very, very powerful, especially when there is no readily apparent, more attractive alternative. That's another big problem that we have in confronting Iran. While recent U.S. statements about the intention to conduct a review of the negotiations at the end of the year are certainly a step in the right direction, I think we need to be very clear that it will still, even at the end of the year, be very difficult to define and to agree upon the precise point where these negotiations will be deemed a failure. And of course, the big problem is that Iran will be using this time in order to proceed full force with its nuclear activity, as it has demonstrated over the past years. An additional problem is that Iran is already aware of the strength of its own bargaining position vis-a-vis the U.S. offer to engage. Iran's response to the U.S. conciliatory message, Obama's conciliatory message on the occasion of Iran's New Year, was to turn the tables on the United States. In other words, rather than relating to its own positions, Iran took that opportunity to focus attention back on the United States. Iran insisted that it was the U.S. that must provide proof of its changed policies. Iran also knows that its bargaining position will increase significantly once it is perceived to have acquired, or is at least one step away from acquiring, a military nuclear capability. So in sum, I would say that for a serious regional approach, the United States would have to find a way to capitalize on the current pressures that Iran faces from within the region, especially following the latest war in Gaza. The bargaining potential of the United States has actually improved because Iran's interest in concluding a deal that improves its regional image and standing has increased. But this opportunity would need to be very, very skillfully played by the United States. Otherwise, it could easily be squandered with Iran gaining the upper hand. I think it's difficult to escape the conclusion that the prospects for effective negotiations along these lines are unfortunately not looking very positive right now, but I'm hopeful that in the end the United States will ultimately get it right. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Emily for a very illuminating and, if I may say, thought-provoking remarks. Both gave us, on the one hand, a comprehensive overview of the development of Arab opinion on the Iran's nuclear aspiration, and certainly pointed out, as I said, in a thought-provoking manner, many of the challenges and problems that the United States faces now in the very difficult balancing act in its dialogue with Iran. And as I said, some of the points she made, I hope will be taken well where they should be.